Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 9th of June and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will look at today's coronavirus update, and then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will look at the news headlines together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,082,892 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,840,017 have been confirmed negative and 242,875 have tested positive. There are 1,011 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There has been one new reported death of a person who had tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus now stands at 7,678. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 121 were in hospital last night, 14 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,422,431 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,313,695 had received their second dose. The latest daily UK figures show that 127,860 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 6 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. As it's Wednesday, we also have an update from National Records of Scotland. As at the 6th of June, 10,130 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by National Records of Scotland today. In the week the 31st of May to the 6th of June, 8 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, the same number of deaths as in the previous week. There were 3 deaths in South Ayrshire, 2 in both Glasgow City and North Lanarkshire, and in the Scottish Borders, 1 death was recorded. The number of deaths from all causes registered in Scotland this week was 1,051, and that's 3% more than the 5-year average. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by an eminently qualified guest, the campaigner Ruth Watson. Ruth founded and has propelled the Keep Scotland the Brand campaign for many years, speaking tirelessly and giving evidence at Westminster. The campaign is a positive initiative which encourages consumers to stand up for Scotland's farmers, fishermen, and our food and drink industries. Good evening, Ruth. Thank you for joining us in Scotland at 7. How are things in Angus this evening?
Well, not too great, to be honest. The town I live in, Kirriemuir, is is number one for COVID positivity, which is not a number one that you want to have. It seems to have started on the back of a celebratory barbecue event for some birthdays in a family last weekend, and quite a fair number of folk have caught it now, including somebody that I know whose strapping adult son is extremely ill. So it's not just the older people that get it. My son met somebody a few weeks ago who had COVID last year, another lad in his 20s, and he had suffered heart failure from it, but is on the mend now, thank goodness. So too many people seem to be thinking that it's gone away. It's not gone away, and this new Delta variant is very, very infectious. There's basically half of Kerry, a sixth, literally 1/6 of Kerry seems to have been hit with it, and the super spreader event just seems to have happened at the weekend.
Those are wise words, Ruth. Thank you. Our thoughts are with anyone who is suffering and who has contracted the virus at the moment, and their families, and also with those who are in the process of recovering, having been infected previously. But that's a useful and relevant update from Angus this evening. Thank you. Our first story is that a judge has ruled that Michael Gove acted unlawfully when the government awarded a contract without a tender to a polling company owned by long-term associates of his and Dominic Cummings, then Boris Johnson's chief advisor. Campaigners had taken legal action against Gove over the decision to pay more than £500,000 of taxpayers' money to the market research firm Public First, following the start of the coronavirus crisis in March 2020, and questioned the involvement of Cummings. Mrs. Justice O'Farrell, who gave the ruling on the Cabinet Office contract with Public First, said the decision of the 5th of June 2020 to award the contract to Public First gave rise to apparent bias and was unlawful. She ruled that the Cabinet Office's failure to identify or consider any other research agency to carry out the work gave the appearance of a real danger that the contract award was biased. The UK government has come under sustained pressure over its handling of taxpayer-funded contracts handed out to friends, party donors and contacts. SNP MP Owen Thompson has previously brought forward the Ministerial Interest Emergency Powers Bill, which would instruct ministers to answer questions about any personal, political or financial connections they may have to a company that has awarded a government contract. Responding to the court ruling, the SNP's Westminster Deputy Leader Kirsten Oswald MP said that the Tory government's handling of multi-billion-pound COVID contracts has been riddled with a catalogue of cronyism. Ms. Oswald said the High Court ruling that the Tory government acted unlawfully when awarding lucrative contracts to friends and contacts is utterly damning. So Ruth, first of all, do you think that this decision from the High Court in London will make any difference to a Tory government which doesn't seem much bothered by the rule of law?
I think it's extremely worrying, and I think that the narrative that has been coming out of this government, which sort of enemies of the people, radical lawyers. I mean, lawyers tend not to be radical. Lawyers tend to follow the law and try and interpret the law. Judges interpret the law. And I think that we're actually in very dangerous days for democracy and for justice when we have a government which seems to be perfectly at ease with proroguing Parliament, lying to the Queen, lying to the people, lying to each other. I guess you can't expect a huge amount more from I shall not put it quite so bluntly, but Mr. Johnson's approach to the women in his life and the honesty which he has treated them with should give us all some idea about how he approaches relationships and honesty. As a man who's been fired twice from jobs for lying, I think that this seems to be a remarkable government in that they no longer try and hide the corruption. They no longer try and hide the veneer of respectability has been stripped. I mean, just today, I actually just double checked it to make sure I got the names right. But Carol Cadwallader, who's a journalist I have a huge amount of respect for, she was retweeting video of Dido Harding, who has, of course, been identified as a potential head of the NHS, a woman who still has not yet managed to explain where the 37 billion for the failed test and trace English COVID response track and trace has gone. There's video of her chatting to the founder of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, about the tremendous potential for the exploitation of data. Now, you tie that in with the fact that there's been a court case ongoing to try and stop the NHS data from being sold off to private data harvesting companies, and you start really to see that there's very few areas where honesty and corruption seems to, there doesn't seem to be a bar too low for this particular administration to step over, run through. I mean, we're past fields of wheat. We're running through common decency with a scythe.
No, that's a very good point that you make, and you draw the connection there between our experience with recent Tory governments and their the extent to which they are connected with the truth or not. Of course, this court action today that's been decided was brought, I think, by the Good Law Project and Joe Maugham QC, who was closely involved with Joanna Cherry MP and and one of the prorogation cases. So it's interesting to see crusaders is perhaps too strong a word, but those who are experienced in operating in the courts being the only ones who appear to be able to hold this Tory government to account.
What's very worrying is that Julian Moore was tweeting. I spend far too much time on Twitter. He was tweeting the other day about one of the laws that's being brought forward about. I can't remember the exact. You need to double check. I haven't got it before me now. But basically saying that the legislation was being proposed that would almost specifically target. Oh, it was crowdfunders. They're looking at trying to stop crowdfunders that might have a political purpose, and that seems to be
Yes.
pretty much specifically looked at people that are trying to hold the government to account. I mean, I think we're a few years or months perhaps off from Queen Elizabeth being sort of, locked up in the Tower and held hostage, as used to be the case when monarchs kind of got out of hand. But we're kind of at the point where the whole population is being held hostage. So I'm not quite sure where we go from here. If we don't stand up against an increasingly oppressive and an increasingly a government which quite happily seems to be flexing its muscles against democracy. I mean, it's subverting Parliament at every opportunity. The Brexit Act, which came into law at the end of I think it was the end of March, means that the Westminster government, MPs there have no means of checking what happens with Brexit trade deals before they go through and become law. So there are many ways in which this government has handed itself power. It hasn't handed itself powers, it's been handed them. I mean, really, if I often come back to this point, but we saw it with Putin. We saw it with Putin a couple of years ago. He brought in laws to change the rules to make him basically president for life. We've seen Donald Trump alluding to the fact that he might try and do the same. I think that there seems to be something of a trend. We're watching Netanyahu squirming like a fish on a hook at the moment, as it looks like his tenure might be coming to an end, and all the potential there for him being sent to prison for corruption. We actually saw it in Malaysia when Najib, who everybody thought was untouchable, a man whose wife is alleged to have have arranged for her handlers or her security depot or department to detonate a grenade on Najib's mistress. I mean, absolutely gruesome stuff. Najib now is in prison, and people thought he would never fall. But he also was trying desperately to keep power at any cost, to try and stop himself from getting in prison. And I think that we're starting to see the tendrils with Cummings. It was astonishing watching Dominic Cummings. I mean, there's a man who's got Sleekit beside his name in the dictionary, and watching him giving his evidence at the COVID inquiry, and talking about basically corporate manslaughter charges being brought against the government. We've got Gove, who's just been found guilty of basically breaking the law. Now, if that's not a breach of ministerial code, I don't know what is. How many more is it going to take for people to be held accountable? And yet still, the popularity ratings seem to be soaring. It's across England. It's extremely worrying. And I keep coming back to this point. Look at your history. Look at what was happening in Germany and German governments in the 1930s. What people are doing now is what people would have done then. If we aren't awake to the threat facing us, just look at what's happening around the world. Look at what happens when you get strong men, so-called strong men leaders, wresting democracy from people. It's very hard to get that back when those freedoms have been lost, and this government seems determined to do that. And the courts keep coming back to this, but we have a government that's basically, I mean, we're basically in the land of Prince John. You know what I mean? It's not good.
Absolutely, Ruth. And the point you're making there was it certainly struck me on Scotland at Seven a couple of weeks ago, where I got a lengthy discussion in connection with Belarus. And it was very apparent in those conversations the long shadow of the events of the 1930s and the 1940s over modern Belarus politics and the people of Belarus. And I was reflecting on that over the weekend and just thinking the same point that you made, the prospect of the shadow of the 1930s and the 1940s starting to fall over other parts of Europe is really quite alarming. Uh, with regard to this particular issue with the UK government in Westminster, uh, do you think that there's the prospect of now seeing greater confrontation between those who are trying to hold the government to account and trying to point out when the government breaks the law, and as you say, a Tory government which seems entirely happy on the basis of its majority and its approval ratings to do whatever it wants?
Well, you have a supine Starmer, and Hoyle seems to have been well picked as Speaker, so I doubt it.
Absolutely right. Of course, of course. Thank you. We'll move on to the next story, which is also in London. And the UK government will seek to exclude the City of London's financial services companies from a global tax overhaul targeting the world's most profitable businesses, agreed between G7 finance ministers last weekend. Chancellor Rishi Sunak is concerned that under a version of the plan put forward by the US president, which involves redistributing the profits of the world's 100 largest businesses, digital businesses such as Google, Amazon, and Facebook, will be joined by banks that he says already pay a fair share of tax. The impact of fair tax proposals could prove to be a significant deterrent to banks running many of their operations from London, compounding the impact of Brexit that resulted in a shift of financial trading to Amsterdam. It is as yet unclear whether all forms of financial services, ranging from banks to investment funds, insurers, and hedge funds, would be excluded in a process that is still to be negotiated. And so, Ruth, looking more generally in the first place, what do you think of this plan to focus on the 100 largest and most profitable companies and to redistribute their tax payments to the countries where their revenues are being raised?
Bring it on, say I. It's one of those things that I am not a socialist, but I think that uh, and Chris McCusker, I'm sure, always rolls his eyes when I say that because I seem to have very socialist principles. But I'm quite happy for people to make lots of money. I'm quite happy for people to be very wealthy. I want that to happen when people have paid their employees a good salary and have paid their taxes. I think that I don't have a problem at all with people being wealthy and having a fantastic lifestyle as long as they haven't got it through corrupt means, and the means by which they have achieved it means that people have good working conditions, good salaries, job security, and I think it is abhorrent that, for example, a primary school in Islay should pay more tax than an estate owner on Islay. So I'm quite happy for all of this to be happening. I think that for President Biden, a man who had to sort of dodge all the sort of swivel-eyed, commie hating nonsense in America, to be bringing this in is absolutely brilliant. It does not surprise me that Rishi Sunak, billionaire, doesn't want this to has suddenly realised with a bit of a yelp that it might hit the money laundering den that is London.
That's an interesting point that you make. As you say, married to the daughter of a billionaire, former banker Rishi Sunak. Do you think this is an example, perhaps again, of in a David Cameron style? Rishi Sunak's has been getting texts from his former colleagues asking him to pull the finger out and to exclude them from inclusion in this tax proposal.
I think that it's a given, isn't it? I mean, you don't have Russian oligarchs and sort of corrupt dictators from developing countries squirreling their money away in various corners of London without having a canny eye to the flexibilities and fluidities that might be involved in, as the Malaysians say, shutting one eye to corruption and wrongdoing. I mean, it's not just a London issue, although London does seem to be particularly favoured by many of the corrupt. Um, it is an issue, it is a global issue, which is why I was actually really encouraged to see that the global leaders were coming together to try and address it. It would be a real irony if after Brexit was forced upon Scotland, many would see it as I do, as a result of the fact that the EU was bringing in sort of anti-corruption laws to try and sort of cast light on the money laundering and the criminality in finance. It would be an irony if, after having inflicted Brexit on the nation to try and hide the wealth of the millionaires and billionaires that send their money here, that Rishi Sunak and his cronies and his colleagues would be undone by an American president.
Absolutely right, Ruth, and also the idea that as we've seen this year and this over the past 12 months, the banking sector in the banking sector in the United Kingdom and banks registered in the UK in particular, returning to profitability. I'm thinking in particular of NatWest Group, but all the UK banks are now profitable once more. How do you think people will respond to the idea that the taxpayer, having bailed out the financial services sector in 2008, and having continued to bear the cost of the significant losses that have been incurred year on year by a number of institutions that were bailed out, and as soon as they return to profitability, they're now pleading special cause and wish to be excluded from taxation proposals? How do you think folks are going to respond to that?
Well, those that know it's happening will be fed up. I mean, those that know it's happening will be furious. Um, I would imagine that most people won't know it's happening because my former colleagues at the BBC and other national media will not tell people that it's happening. You get a baby box that makes headline news for about a month, and yet criminality and government corruption and business corruption and the nuances of business corruption just gets elided. It gets sort of swept from history, and so only those who are paying attention seem to know about it. However, one of the pluses of coronavirus, the very few things that actually has been an interesting phenomenon, is the amount of people who are sitting at home watching the telly and watching the news, and the penny is beginning to drop. Lots more people are spending time online trying to find facts, and the penny is dropping. That we are in strange days. And I think that it's one of the reasons why I think that people should be supporting our online independent media, because I think that really gives people an opportunity to see the news that they wouldn't see otherwise. But certainly, I think that in order to have people truly engaging, we have to have real responsible taxation. It makes no sense to me that students who are paying back their student loans should be hit with a 6% tax when interest rates but I remember when they first started out, and it was meant to be a 1.5 interest rate, and then it changed to 6% when it was handed over to somebody's chum, and the students weren't given a chance to shift their loan elsewhere. So let's just charge all of the people we've bailed out 6% at least. How about a wee bit more? How about 25 or 30% on these mega million salaries, and that will just make things a wee bit fairer.
The need for fairness and the perception of fairness are points that you're absolutely right to make, and and as you say, broadcasters who are not subject to the pressures that perhaps some of the establishment are, and so broadcasters like Broadcasting Scotland will continue to report the stories and discuss the stories, whether or not they're carried in the mainstream media. I'll move now to talks in Westminster again, and talks between the EU and the UK over Northern Ireland appear to be on the brink of collapse, as London indicated it was still considering unilateral action to keep unhindered supplies flowing from Great Britain into the region. The European Commission Vice President, Maroš Šefčovič, said patience was wearing very, very thin, and described the relationship with the UK as at a crossroads. Amid fears that the escalating crisis over Northern Ireland would develop into a trade war, Lord David Frost, the Brexit minister, said there had been no breakthroughs over the Brexit checks, but no breakdowns after a 2-hour meeting with Šefčovič in London. They agreed to continue to try to find a solution before 30th of June, when a ban on chilled meats, including sausages and mince, is due to come into force. The DUP have called on the UK government to act unilaterally if the European Union does not agree to ease the flow of goods between Britain and Northern Ireland. The Democratic Unionist Party leader Edwin Poots said if Brussels is deaf to the problems, then the London government must act unilaterally to protect Northern Ireland, and he called for the Northern Ireland Protocol to be removed. The protocol was negotiated by Boris Johnson in October 2019 and forms part of the withdrawal agreement, which came into force on the 31st of January 2020. So firstly, Ruth, in general terms, where do you think these talks between Westminster and the EU are heading?
Well, it's hard to tell, isn't it? I mean, here you've got David Frost, the man who negotiated a terrific deal, now complaining that the deal that idiot David Frost negotiated is terrible. I mean, what are the EU supposed to do? It's a legal binding contract. It's an international treaty, and there would be the potential for some flexibility, I guess, within the parameters of it, if only the EU could believe that the that the Westminster government was going to behave as an honest broker. But here, yet again, we have that whole perfidious Albion scenario where you've got, I mean, it's almost as though David Frost and Boris Johnson, don't think that the Europeans, negotiators and traders can read the newspapers and what they're saying. I mean, how can you have a trade agreement, an agreement that was, forms the basis of a really significant deal, and they're going, oh yeah, but we don't like that bit. That bit doesn't matter. Actually, that bit is the most fundamental bit because it forms the basic premise of the EU, which is a single market, and the integrity of the single market. Now, you've got the Department for International Trade sending out multiple notifications for pardon me, I'm going burpees. You send multiple contracts out, or going out to tender, saying that they're looking for feedback. That's what I'm looking for. That they're looking for feedback and input on negotiated trade deals with Canada, with Mexico, with Australia, with New Zealand, with India, and the CTPP. I don't know what it is. The CPTPP, the International Pacific Rim Trade Deal. And everyone's watching and looking and going, well, actually, here we go. You've got one fundamental trade deal, the first trade deal that the UK has negotiated in 40 or 50 years, and they're away to break it, they're away to lie, they're away to just behave like shysters. Why is anyone going to agree? Why is anybody going to sign a deal with them? And if they are going to sign a deal, it's going to be totally nailed down. You've already got the World Trade Organization telling Boris Johnson that he can't have his floating buffoonery of the yacht. This nonsense. A wee boatie. He thinks that international leaders are going to be impressed by signing a deal on a boat. Like nobody else has boats in their countries. And you've got the World Trade Organization turning around saying, no, you can't have it built in Blighty as, great British baked off yachts. You know what I mean? You can't have that because that goes against World Trade Organization deals. So you've got this entire situation where Brexit land has become this diminished pimple on the rear end of a mud-soaked porcine. It is ridiculous.
It's a good point that you make, Ruth, and I was reflecting there while you were speaking. If it is the case that Edwin Poots is now involved, as you would expect, is now involving himself so much in recent history, and Edwin Poots being someone who is reported believes that the planet Earth is only 4,000 years old, and who denies Darwinian theory, if someone who has such a particular view of accepted scientific reality is now the one person who's supporting or is provoking the plans to renege on the withdrawal agreement, to remove the Northern Ireland Protocol. Does that tell us something about the sort of people who are now supporting Boris Johnson and Lord David Frost in their endeavours?
I think that it actually is a mistake to take a reductionist approach to politics in Northern Ireland. I think that Mr. Poots would support anybody that would help maintain his worldview of what Northern Ireland should look like and how that should be. I think that Mr. Poots would back anybody that would help him maintain his adherence to the union. I think that we underestimate significantly the strength of feeling that goes into a large section of Northern Irish culture and politics, and it's very dangerous. And I think that Mr. Johnson is playing a very, very dangerous game. I do not think it is. I can't remember the precise law, but it was voted on a few months ago, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it happened just before the Northern Irish, the border in the Irish Sea was instigated, and it was a law which says basically that MI5 can carry out murder and rape and a range of criminality on behalf of the British state, and their agents need not fear any kind of legal retribution for that. They won't be held accountable. And having seen the way in which the British state acted in Northern Ireland over the last few hundred years, but in recent history, so looking at the 1960s and 70s and 80s, I do not think that it is beyond the realms of reason to think that Mr. Poots feels emboldened in some of the some of the risks and some of the threats that he is implying, because it's well known. It's well known after the Good Friday Agreement was written. It became very well known that the British state supported and funded the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and other paramilitaries. And I think that we are very dangerous days.
Yes, of course, Ruth. The points you make are absolutely right, and we'll be watching very closely over the summer as events in Northern Ireland and the border in the Irish Sea and relations between Belfast and Dublin and London as they evolve, and will come. I'm absolutely confident that we'll come back to them.
And
Uh,
America. And America. I
and
mean, and that's the big wild card in there is Mr. Biden,
it's
President Biden's coming over, and that. I mean, I think that we're really in for a year of politics that we never thought we were going to have.
I think that's a fair point. The events in Cornwall will be watched. In St Ives will be watched very closely this week to see what President Biden says, in particular with regard to Ireland, Northern Ireland,
Mm.
both in public and I suspect in private. What we will do, well, actually, what I should do is just is briefly, insofar as the issues that are being discussed with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment relate in part to the import and export of foodstuffs between the mainland of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. What do you think are the implications for Scotland's agricultural and food production sectors?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge because I know of several dairies, for example, in Dumfries and Galloway, who have lost their market in Ireland. That's it. The market's gone. I mean, it was a really lucrative market. It's just, Northern Ireland is just a couple of, a wee short hop across the water, and that's now gone. So they're trying to diversify and reach other markets. That's just one small example. It's that's it. It's gone. I know fishmongers in Dumfries and Galloway. Their market is gone, and I think. I mean, the Northern Irish farmers actually are in a better situation than many because at least they've got Europe to export to. They've got the rest of Ireland to export to. Um, I think that the problem is going to be felt much more by Scottish farmers who are losing markets in Northern Ireland, and I think that it actually shows we're a way to get the next few months. We're a way to see the next few days. We're a way to see the new tranche of customs regulations and customs paperwork that needs to be filled out being implemented. There was a transition after the transition in terms of paperwork, because people just knew that it was going to be too complicated, and we've got hauliers refusing to come to the UK because it's just going to be too much of an effort. We're already seeing empty shelves. I mean, my local supermarket, I don't know about you guys, but my local supermarket last week, there was hardly any fruit and veg on the shelves. And you're seeing, for example, in Sainsbury's down south, well, I'm up north, so it's kind of down south could well be Glasgow, but you're seeing these kind of shelf fillers with sort of cardboard where there should be food, sort of like cardboard, bright coloured advertising where there should be food. And I think that this is going to be more of an issue. I think for our fishing communities who have sailed the Irish Sea for many, many centuries and now find that they can't perhaps it's harder for them to take a port in a storm, perhaps, or if they do take a port in a storm, they can't, they've got to be careful where they go and what they do, whereas perhaps they couldn't, they didn't have to worry about it before. So I think I just feel so depressed about the whole thing. The only thing that keeps me going is polishing my anger into some kind of burnished, non-violent, direct action, because it's the only thing that kind of keeps me sane, is the thought that actually if I channel all that rage into trying to tell people what's coming so they can stand up and make an informed choice, then that's at least what I can do. Actually, one of the reasons I spend half my life, the reason I'm all clarty, I don't know if you can see me now, I'm all clarty, is I've just come in from the field. I've started a community garden. I am so worried about my community not having enough food. I've started a community garden to try and do what I can to feed people on low budgets, because food prices are going up, and if Liz Truss gets her way, we're going to have our shelves filled with food you wouldn't want to eat. So I'm just doing what I can, one shovelful at a time.
Well, that's brilliant, Ruth. With regard to your burnishing your anger, I'm pretty sure that your anger is going to end up so bright we're going to have to wear shades, to coin a phrase. But community gardens and digging for other people sounds like it's going to become a feature of many of our lives going forward. I'll return to Westminster now, because Ian Blackford has called on the Prime Minister to commit to a straight vote in the House of Commons on aid spending, accusing the UK government of running from its moral and legal responsibilities. Speaking during Prime Minister's questions, the SNP's Westminster leader also questioned ahead of the G7 later this week what kind of world leader cuts water and hygiene projects by more than 80% in the middle of a global pandemic. Commenting, Ian Blackford pointed out that later this week the Prime Minister will walk into the G7 summit as the only leader cutting development aid to the world's poorest. Mr. Blackford said, "At the very moment when global leadership is needed more than ever, this Tory government is walking away from millions still struggling from the COVID pandemic and a permanent poverty pandemic." So, Ruth, we've touched on this already this evening, but it's a theme that seems to have threaded its way through our conversation this evening. What insight do you think it gives us to this Tory government that it's determined to walk away from its moral and legal obligations to the very poorest people?
Just as in keeping with every policy we've seen coming out of Westminster from the Conservatives for the last few years, isn't it? I mean, it's Marcus Rashford, a young footballer, had to be the voice of conscience, a conscience that pushed Johnson into feeding school children. I mean, Boris Johnson is a man who apparently is incapable of finding anybody to cook a meal for him, so he's getting takeouts paid for him by a Tory funder. I mean, what, £80,000 for takeouts? How many posh sandwiches can you eat? How many grilled paninis does it take to feed a man and his wife and a bairn? You know what I mean? And here's a man who would see, of course, Boris Johnson has no concept of what it is not to have enough to wash your hands, not to have clean water to feed a child so that it doesn't die in front of you with its innards poured out across the floor. Of course, Mr. Johnson has no concept of that. But on top of that, you've got Raab out in Saudi Arabia meeting the man who almost certainly murdered Khashoggi, the journalist Khashoggi, and had him dismembered and disposed of. A man who is promoting Wahhabist extremism, a man who's almost certainly behind a large part of the conflict in Yemen, which is seeing disgusting and disgraceful mortality among the most fragile of lives. And we're selling the bombs. We're selling them the bombs and the munitions. Of course, Mr. Johnson has no concept of why. He probably doesn't even know, and he probably doesn't even care. I mean, it's one of those issues that gets me so infuriated, because the decent people on the street, if you speak to anybody in the street and say, do you think it's okay that a child should drink water filled with filth? Or do you think we should perhaps help them? How about if you've got Priti Patel complaining about people, desperate people, throwing themselves and their families at people smugglers? How about we help people live decent lives in the countries that they live? You think people would get in the back of a people smuggler's truck, climb on a dinghy, hold their children? So you've got a 15-month-old baby washed up on the shores of Norway after his family's drowned and found bobbing on the sea months before. You think they would do that if their own lives and their own homes were safe and they had clean water, they had a future? People want to live in their own homeland. People would not do that if they had a decent life at home, if we weren't selling the bombs that were going to blast them out their homes. So it is an issue which I would like to see somebody tackle, Mr. Johnson and his cohorts, perhaps with some credibility at the G7 about, because I'd like to be sat in a room with him for 10 minutes, I can tell you.
Definitely. Good points, well made there, Ruth. Thank you. We'll come back to Scotland now, and the eviction of a West Lothian resident with a disabled son was halted at the last minute thanks to pressure from the Living Rent campaign, supported by Hannah Bardell MP and Lorna Slater, the MSP. The Scottish Greens co-leader and Lothian MSP Lorna Slater said this shows the need for the eviction ban to be extended. Lorraine Robinson Mosley from Livingston, whose son has severe autism, was set to lose her home on Wednesday, despite accommodation which meets her disabled son's needs not being available for another 3 weeks. But the eviction was delayed at the 11th hour to give her time to move her vulnerable family to a safer home. The Scottish Government introduced an eviction ban in December after this case was raised by the Scottish Greens, but after West Lothian moved down to level 3, the eviction order was progressed by sheriff officers. This family would have been evicted today if it wasn't for the intervention of Living Rent, Hannah Bardell, the local SNP MP, and the Scottish Green co-leader. Ms Slater said that the fact that their landlord was ready to kick this family out of their home during COVID restrictions and before suitable alternative accommodation was ready shows why we need more legal protection for tenants. It is unacceptable to evict people from their homes during this crisis. That's why I called for the eviction ban to be extended last week, so situations like this would not arise, Ms Slater said. So Ruth, what do you think this says about the state of the private rented housing sector in Scotland at the moment?
Now, I have to declare an interest because I am a landlord, and I actually really welcome. I'm one of those rare landlords, I think, that I welcome legislation which protects tenants, because I think there's actually a lot of scummy landlords out there. But I don't know the particular circumstances of this family, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know. The last thing you want, and I'm not saying that this is the case with this family, but the last thing, if, for example, you've got an antisocial family who are like kicking in the walls or pulling off the doors, you know what I mean, then you have to have some kind of redress as a landlord. So I'll sort of stick that out there, although I have to say that my tenants were all very well behaved and very nice people, as I'm sure this lady and her family are. I think that it is, I'll put it this way. We were selling a flat years ago when we were living away. We'd kept a property when we moved away from Scotland, and we decided we were going to sell it when we were moving back. We decided we were going to sell it, and there was a family living in it, and this was an Edinburgh property. And if we put it on the open market, then we probably could have got more for it. But to the surprise of our selling agent, we insisted on giving the family that was living there first refusal. And when they couldn't get the money together within the allotted time, we asked how long they needed, and they told us, and we gave them that time because, you know, why wouldn't you do that? That's just like being a decent human being. So I think that it's one of those things that, yes, we have to have protections against tenants that are that are genuinely disruptive and are genuinely, either have criminal or unpleasant and dangerous behaviours, for their neighbours and for the community. Um, but I think it's really important that we have considered and robust legislation, and I would really like to see landlords professionalised. I would welcome the requirement that there be decent, that's a problem, decent factors that, or like stair communities, or you know what I mean, sort of. I think that it's actually really important that people come together. I've actually tried to do something similar with the flat that I own now, is to get all the owners in a stair together so that we can have upkeep of the stair, we can look after the gardens, because I think that it's our duty as a landlord. I have a flat, I want to get the money from the tenants, but I want that to be in return for them having a home. I want that while they want to live there. If I have no reason to be, if I perhaps, I don't know. I mean, perhaps that landlord was facing bankruptcy and had to sell. I don't know what his circumstances were. I don't know what the story is in that one, because it's not a story I'm familiar with. I understand that circumstances happen which mean that people might have to dispose of their flats. But I think that it would be behoven upon them to try and when you've, especially when you've got somebody who's got a disabled son in the middle of a pandemic, I think it would have been perhaps something that the landlord could have spoken to the housing agent and tried to come up with a solution, which would have meant perhaps them either having a 3 week leeway, perhaps they could have had, there has to be some way to try and mitigate a situation. You know what I mean? I don't understand. If it wasn't so urgent that if the guy didn't have to sell, if the landlord didn't have to sell the flat because he was facing bankruptcy, then why would you do that to somebody? I just don't understand it.
Now that's an interesting point that you make, Ruth, and I was going to expand the scope of the conversation a little bit to think about the process that may be starting of us learning lessons from the pandemic about reprioritizing and about protecting people and protecting people who may not have been protected particularly much over the last 10 or 20 years. Do you think there's scope for us to learn lessons about, for example, the value that some of the lowest paid in our economy, the value that they bring to our economy, and also the need to balance, as you would say, the need to balance the interests of landlords and tenants in order to have a private rented housing sector in Scotland that works.
I think that private rented accommodation has a real role to play. I lived in rented accommodation for many years, and that gave me the freedom that I wanted to move around, because I was all over the place. I was up in Shetland, in Orkney, in Australia, Malaysia. I didn't, I needed rented accommodation. I wasn't in a position to be buying and settling down at that point. But the deal is, you give somebody your money and you have a home, and that person treats you with respect and they look after that property. It's a two-way street. And I'm really lucky that I've had so many good landlords that have actually, people who've treated me really well. I had a landlord that used to send Christmas cards and a pound to my kids 20 years later. You know what I mean? I've had really good landlords, and they've shown me how to be a good landlord. But it shouldn't be up to chance. I think that we have to professionalize the private sector and landlords, and I think that it is primarily, we have to recognise that accommodation isn't an investment; it is a home. Somebody, yes. I have a flat, and I want that flat to make me money, and it is an asset that I will have. But I view that primarily as a transaction. I am giving somebody a home, and while they want that to be their home, then they should be safe and secure and comfortable, and have it to the best standard that I can maintain it to. And I think that poverty is an issue that is glossed over. How is it we have working poor in a country as rich as Scotland? It comes back to our issue about tax and taxation. We've got all these folk who own loads of all these billionaires and millionaires and wealthy people, or people, I mean, you see portfolios of flats, and and they seem to get their money by paying people low wages. And then we as taxpayers support those, boost the salaries of those people by giving them universal credit, and that the people that are paying their tax, the people, the wealthy, the people who are wealthy end up, they're being subsidized by us to get wealthy because they can't afford, they're not paying people a living wage and we're boosting that. So how about we tax people fairly, pay people decent salaries, and then they can afford to live and eat and have a decent salary, and pay a decent living wage. I think universal basic income is one of the most exciting things that is before us, and I really think we should be exploring it. And I think we really have to have a reset. I'm actually really excited at the prospect of the Greens having more influence in Holyrood, uh, because I think that they will hold the SNP administration to account, and hopefully push through a lot more of the kind of common wheel policies that you see that are about social justice, that maintain the social contract, that perhaps help hit the reset button. One of the things I'm really excited about is the fact that suddenly during COVID we managed to end homelessness. Well, how about we keep that going? How is it that it's okay to see people sitting, sitting out in the cold? It's not right. Scotland can do better, and we should do better.
It's a good point that you make, Ruth. I'm sure it was reported earlier this week that homeless people who were being accommodated in St Ives were being removed from their accommodation in order to provide space for those who were attending and servicing the G7 meeting. So your point's absolutely right in terms of the prioritisation of everybody and balancing the interests of our community as a whole. I'm going to move quickly to some international news. And the Belarus opposition leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, called on Wednesday for an international tribunal to be set up to investigate what she called the crimes of Alexander Lukashenko's dictatorship. Lukashenko has kept a tight grip on Belarus since rising to power in 1994 and has cracked down on street protests that began last year over the presidential election, which opponents and international critics say was rigged so that he could retain power. I call for an international tribunal to be set up which would investigate the crimes of Lukashenko's dictatorship in the past and during the election in 2020, Tikhanovskaya told the Czech Senate, but gave no other details of her proposal. Tikhanovskaya, who is now based in Lithuania, met Czech President Miloš Zeman and Prime Minister Andrej Babiš during her visit to the Czech Republic. Tikhanovskaya was visiting Prague before a summit of the Group of Seven advanced economies in the UK this week, at which Belarus is expected to be discussed. She said the only solution to the situation in Belarus was holding free elections with international monitors. And so, Ruth, do you think that perhaps the application of international laws and norms and discussions at the G7 might eventually begin to isolate Lukashenko from his remaining political supporters?
Well, one of the problems is that one of his big remaining political supporters is Putin, who is propping him up, because Lukashenko is the buffer. I mean, the fact that we have not yet seen the kind of response that I would have expected to, with the Belarusian hijacking of a passenger plane, basically kidnapping hundreds of people on board and removing a Roman Protasevich? Pardon if I mispronounce the name, but and then you see Protasevich appearing on television just the other night, obviously having been subject to, one might imagine, some fairly horrific behaviours from Lukashenko's government, saying that he didn't, he thought Lukashenko was a great guy. I mean, I think that we have to view what is happening with Lukashenko in the prism of what is happening in the wider region. So you've got Putin sort of expanding his tendrils through Lukashenko, but also the whole thing about expanding passports for the Crimeans, people living in Crimea, sort of the annexed part of the Ukraine, giving them Russian passports. This is a tactic that the KGB and the USSR basically put in, across Lithuania, Latvia, and across the USSR to try and, I mean, the Chinese are doing it now, I guess, in parts of Mongolia and other areas, sort of introducing people with a different either ethnic background or political or philosophical background into a region to try and either destabilize it or to dilute the sense of culture, the sense of force.
Okay.
So I hope Lukashenko is addressed. But in order to address him, you have to start wrestling the beast, which is Putin. And I'm not sure that anybody has the stomach for that yet. And that's of grave concern because Putin is one of the most destabilizing forces. To watch Putin and his history and his background and his philosophy is to recognize that we're actually dealing with somebody who is a significant disruptor of democracy.
Absolutely, Ruth. Thank you. And we'll now pivot from Belarus to the Hebrides in a way that only we on Broadcasting Scotland can pivot. And the procurement of a new ferry to help support the community and economy on Islay is officially underway. The first stage of the tender process will assess if interested shipyards meet the technical and financial criteria to take on the project. The invitation to tender is expected to be issued later this summer, with a view to awarding the contract with an estimated value of around £50 million in March 2022. The start of the procurement follows engagement with key stakeholders and members of the local community on the design of the new ferry. Minister for Transport Graham Day said, "I'm pleased to announce the process to build a new ferry for Islay is formally underway. The route is one of the busiest services for freight on the Clyde and Hebrides network, and this new vessel will help to grow the island's economy as well as bring added resilience to the fleet." So, Ruth, we've seen issues this spring already with a lack of resilience in Caledonian McBrain's fleet and the cancellation of services to the Outer Hebrides and to Islay as a result of a succession of breakdowns. So, is this announcement by Graham Day, is it a little too late, do you think?
I guess it would have been better if the announcement had been made 10 years ago and the new ferries had been brought in by now, but we are where we are. I mean, I understand that there's a significant amount of frustration in Islay, given how much Islay pumps into Scotland's economy thanks to the whisky that it produces and the many fine whiskies it produces. And a beautiful island it is. I went to the Islay show a couple of years ago, and it was my first time there. It was a beautiful place. Managed to get our camper van stuck in the mud, which caused some hilarity. But that was getting pulled out by a tractor. But that was a whole other story. And so I've got experience of going on the Isle of Ferry as is, and I'm a sucker for ferries. I love ferries. I've lived in islands for many years, and I like a good ferry and a good ferry trip. And I think Caledonia McBrain is doing a really good job under difficult circumstances. And I've no idea why it's taking so long for the ferry situation to get sorted out. It would be nice to think that perhaps Ferguson Shipyard might get some of the work. It'd be nice to think that, but then we've got to keep an eye on the WTO. We don't want to sort of fall foul of WTO. And
That's a good point that you make, Ruth, in terms of the procurement rules for constructing ferries have, of course, changed now in the UK as we left the European Union. We also know that in Scotland, industrial policy and political concerns and engineering issues significantly impacted the construction of the two ferries, which are still waiting at Ferguson's to be finished and to be launched. Do you think that there's perhaps a sign here that Scotland needs to be looking at an industrial policy which addresses both the needs of ALICs and businesses on Islay, for example, but also industrial policy which looks at the resilience in the supply chain for building critical infrastructure such as ferries?
yes, of course. I think that we should have. I mean, Scotland's always been a seafaring nation. I think that we should get shipbuilding sorted out, get industry and jobs back into communities, and open up our ferry services to Europe again, so that we're not reliant on the backlog coming through Calais and all the siphoning off that goes from there. I think that Scotland should have a robust infrastructure which we service either ourselves or in partnership with other nations. And I see no reason why we should do that if Scotland would only make some sensible decisions about our future.
Well, we'll keep reporting on news from the Hebrides and all around Scotland on Broadcasting Scotland in order that we report stories that are important to local people and to the country as a whole. And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. Very many thanks to Ruth for joining us this evening and sharing her thoughts and insight and local experiences. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we're always looking for support, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can also contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. Ruth, thank you again for all of your contributions and help this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.